protesting the island's dire economic conditions, food shortages, and the slow pace of COVID-19 vaccinations. In one area of Havana, protesters clashing with police. Elsewhere, they chanted "repressors" at riot police. Cubans voicing anger over the repression of civil liberties and the handling of the pandemic, amid what many are describing as the country's worst economic crisis in decades.
And of course, that economic crisis in Cuba is only exacerbated by US sanctions and the US embargo, which of course was re-implemented by the Trump administration. We'll get to those details in just a second. But first, some additional context in regard to the protests that have broken out in Cuba. Thousands of Cubans have taken to the streets to protest the government's handling of coronavirus and the food shortages. The economic situation there is in fact dire, especially considering the fact that Americans who typically would send US currency to family members in Cuba are no longer able to do that. So that lifeline has been squashed by the sanctions that again were implemented during the Trump administration. Now the protests began early Sunday afternoon in the municipality of San Antonio de los Baños in the Artemisa province adjacent to Havana. A few hours later, they had spread to the east of the country in provinces such as Santiago de Cuba. Now Biden has already weighed in on this after much pressure from Senator Marco Rubio, who has decided to exploit these protests to spread his anti-socialist messaging. And Biden said this: "We stand with the Cuban people and their clarion call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic and from the decades of repression and economic suffering to which they have been subjected by Cuba's authoritarian regime." But let me just be clear in stating that while Biden campaigned on lifting those economic sanctions, he was then elected into office and refused to do anything about them, mostly because he wants to appeal to Cubans and Venezuelans in South Florida who have no interest in voting for him anyway. So it's a weak move by Biden. There's unnecessary pain and suffering in Cuba as a result of those sanctions. And if he genuinely does care about doing something positive in regard to the economic situation there, the only thing he can do, the only thing he should do as the president is lift those sanctions.
Okay, so I think this is a complicated story. Let's go through a couple of the different angles here. So first of all, is Cuba an authoritarian regime? Absolutely. Would I prefer that the people of Cuba have freedom? Absolutely. And actual democracy, which they do not have now. Okay, the Castros have been in charge forever. It's clearly a dictatorship, okay? And all the dreams of communism are honestly nonsense. There was never any communism there. Communism almost always turns into dictatorships, and that's what it turned into here. It may remind me of the libertarians. Oh, the government will melt away. No, the government will melt away until there's one dictator. So on the other hand, are we making the situation considerably worse for the people of Cuba through our embargo? Definitely. Right? And you could be against regime change and you could be against the embargo and still be against the dictatorship that runs Cuba. You know, I say it's complicated, it's actually not that complicated. It's easy to say, hey, listen, we feel terrible for the people of Cuba. Our heart goes out to them. But I think us trying to do regime change through either violent means like we normally do in the Middle East, bombings, etc., or coups as we normally do in Latin America, or through impose suffering upon the people until they get so mad and so frustrated and so hungry and so sick, they try to overturn their own government. Well, that's a very bad strategy and it's a very immoral strategy. But I'm gonna add one layer here, then this is the only part where it actually does get some degree of nuance, right? So most folks now say sanctions are always bad. I don't agree with that. I think it really depends. And remember, BDS is in some sense a boycott movement that you can call a sanction movement, and that's where again it gets complicated and nuanced, right? And the best example of sanctions working was in the case of apartheid South Africa. But the key to whether it's going to work or not, in my opinion, is if there is a dispersed power base and you affect the financial interest of the ruling class.
Yes.
If you do that, then you could actually move a government as we did in South Africa. And you could do it, and in that case, there was no violence. We actually pushed through economic pressure, right? But when you do it against dictators, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Assad in Syria or the Castros in Cuba or Kim Jong-un in North Korea, there's no chance of it working because the dictator is always gonna have enough caviar. And by definition, the dictator doesn't care about his people. So it's not like, oh my God, my people are sick and hungry, I'm so moved. No, Kim Jong-un started concentration camps. He's not moved by the suffering of his people, and neither are the Castros.
Right.
So what America's trying to do is, if we make the people of those countries suffer so badly that they're gonna die either way, maybe they'll do a violent overthrow of their own government. Like I said earlier, that's a deeply immoral policy, and it's not gonna work.
Yeah, so there's so much I want to touch on because it's important to understand the context, the political context in which this uprising currently is taking place. So first off, Raul Castro actually stepped down. You're right in that it's not a democracy. They don't have elections. They don't have democratically elected leaders. But their new president, relatively new president, is Miguel Diaz-Canel, and he is not a product of the Cuban Revolution, which is actually a pretty interesting part to this story, because for those countries that are looking at this as a possible way of pushing for regime change, I'm curious if they see this change in leadership as a potential vulnerability in Cuba. The fact that Biden refused to lift the sanctions, I think, is incredibly problematic, especially when you look at the Obama administration lifting the embargo, then Trump coming in, re-implementing it, and then Biden campaigning on lifting it, but then he never did, and he doesn't plan to. So to pretend like he's concerned about the economic situation of Cubans right now, while insisting on keeping the sanctions in place is just disgusting and ridiculous, right? Now, the other thing I wanted to mention was, the Cubans in South Florida who are arguing that lifting the sanctions does nothing other than provide more money to Cuban authoritarians. No, that's not true, right? Because the sanctions did one thing in specific that harms Cubans in the country right now. So I'm gonna go to this video, it touches on it a little bit, and then I'll fill in the blanks when we come back.
A lot happening.
President Joe Biden came to office promising changes in US policy toward Cuba. But months after he moved into the White House, sanctions remain in place and diplomacy is strained at best. The crippling effects of the US embargo recently led to the suspension of cash deposits in US dollars, a major source of income for ordinary Cubans.
It affects me from the point of view that I have relatives abroad who send me foreign currency, but well, we will look for other ways for it to arrive.
It's all a far cry from President Obama's historic visit in 2016, when relations were normalized, the US embassy reopened, and travel to Cuba allowed. President Biden, it seems, is not following suit.
A Cuba policy shift or additional steps is currently not among the president's top foreign policy priorities, but it is an issue, of course, we will remain engaged in and focused on.
In essence, that means retaining hundreds of tough measures put in place by President Trump, including redesignating Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism.
So Cuba is designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. Biden has not reversed that. Consider the fact that these sanctions remain in place during a pandemic when people need help, right? And we're not just doing it in Cuba, we're also doing it in Iran and also in Syria. And so couple that with the fact that they've lost a lot of money in regard to the lack of tourism. That's how a lot of Cubans make money, right? So the coronavirus crisis, which caused the closure of airports and slowed down tourism by more than 80%, Cuba's second source of income after its medical missions, has exacerbated the shortage and fueled popular discontent. And what's also interesting, Cenk, is if you look at the narrative that's playing out here in the United States, it's hard to research a story like this in the United States relying on US media, because they just say this is about socialism. They're just protesting socialism. No, It's way more complicated than that. It's not just, oh, they're protesting socialism. And that's when, you hear Chomsky talk about manufacturing consent. This is what he's talking about. Simplifying the matter on the ground and making this about dueling economic systems, when in reality, it's a complex issue that is exacerbated by the United States and its long history of wanting regime change in Cuba.
Yeah. So more critique for everyone involved in this story. I agree with what Anna's saying. When I read the mainstream media on this, it's so hard to discern what's true or not true. On domestic issues, it's easier to discern. I had a conversation with Noam Chomsky about this in an interview we did recently, where we shared notes on how do you read the media and discern the truth from the framing and the lies and the manufacturing of consent. And on domestic issues where we have a lot more information, it's easier to do. On foreign policy issues, I don't trust the New York Times or any of these outlets I read at all. They always frame it as, oh, the people of Cuba are so mad at the socialism and the communism and they have risen up in their anger. There's barely any mention of embargoes. It lacks all nuance. And I just don't know if it's almost unadulterated propaganda or not, right? And I wish I had honest accounting and reporting from inside there, because look, again, the dictatorship there has tons of faults. So in terms of Miguel Diaz-Canel, I'm not an expert on him. I don't know to what degree he's basically serving Raul Castro's interests, but it doesn't really matter because it's the same idea and the same ideology and the same set of folks that are still running the country, right? And in terms of blame for them, they deserve plenty. So they're trying to develop their own vaccine, and they won't let any other scientists look at it in the international world. Now, Cuba has a healthcare program that they're very proud of, and for a long time, rightfully proud of. So in America, we do propaganda where we say, oh, Cuba is just a hellhole and there's nothing good in it. No, the healthcare in Cuba, generally speaking, has been good to excellent, right? There's many other problems though. But in this case, they refuse to participate with anybody in the outside world. That is a terrible idea. What if the outside world develops a great vaccine and you don't? Well, then you got to get that vaccine to your people. And time is of the essence here. It reminded me of Texas saying, we don't want to connect our energy grid to anybody else's energy grid. We're independent. And then their energy grid went down and they weren't connected. And so their people suffered. So in a sense, it's similar here in Cuba. So yes, they have tons of blame for the Cuban government. But then back to us, Biden's hypocrisy, as usual, is unbearable, right? Oh, I promised you this because I want to pretend to be progressive when I'm running for office, because I know that voters love progressives. They love progressive positions. I just get the mainstream media to smear Biden, to smear Bernie Sanders, who's the actual progressive in the race, call him a communist and say he's going to execute people in Central Park. And then I give them progressive talking points because I know they love it. And then I get into office and guys, just kidding, on 70% of them at least. We give credit where credit is due. He withdrew from Afghanistan. He got rid of net neutrality rules that Trump put in that were terrible, or anti-net neutrality rules. But on stuff like this, he always goes back to his deeply conservative roots. And so here he's celebrating the misery of the Cuban people. Ha, we're gonna keep Trump's embargo. And Obama was terrible on most issues like this too, but not on this one. Please guys, on every issue, use your judgment, use your mind. Not everything is black and white. So Obama was great on Cuba. He opened it back up and that was the right direction to go. Now Biden is going backwards.
Yeah, one final thing I wanted to mention about Cuba and some of the more exciting things that were taking place within the country was, I think we've been clear on mentioning some of the downsides of that authoritarian government. However, they were opening up their economy, not to multinational corporations, but what they were doing was beginning to open up their economy to worker co-ops. So the means of production were transferred from the government to the actual workers in the various companies in Cuba, which was exciting stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I'm worried that right now Cuba's in a vulnerable position, and with more and more pressure by both business interests, South Florida, and people like Marco Rubio, Biden's gonna double down on US sanctions. Biden's gonna continue, Biden's still recognizes Juan Guaido as the leader of Venezuela. He wasn't democratically elected. He's not the leader of Venezuela. So I think that Cuba at the moment is in a vulnerable position. I think that it's also wrong to minimize the concerns of the protesters. But as an American, if you're watching this and you're wondering what should the United States role be in this situation, the only role is to lift the sanctions. That's it, that's it. The fact that the US wants regime change is wrong, and understand why they want regime change, because they want to open that country up to the same exploitation that was taking place during the Batista regime.
And I'm going to give one last piece of hypocrisy here. It's from one of our members, Mickey C. the Silver Dragon wrote it, and I'm glad he did. He said, Biden is anti-Cuba because it's not a democracy. Good thing that our buddies in Saudi Arabia and Israel are democracies. And so that's such a great point, and it exposes the hypocrisy of the US government, now led by Joe Biden. So Saudi Arabia is not within miles, planets of a democracy. Obvious, massive dictatorship at its worst, right? But as long as they're giving us oil and natural resources, yay, Saudi Arabia, okay? And Cuba, on the other hand, has 1,000 problems, but worker co-ops, were way better than communism, or forget communism, the government control through the authoritarian government that they had. Instead, we go and crush that, because it's not that we're worried that they're too left-wing or that they're actually communists or that they're dictators. We're worried that they're not letting us rob them of their natural resources. And if you don't agree to that, then we're gonna smear you in every possible way. That's why be wary of US government propaganda, and honestly, in this case, US media propaganda. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.